Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going somewhere a little different. We're going to take a deep dive into a world of international espionage, bioweapons, and a pandemic, really,
Yeah, it sounds like
like a movie.
right.
Oh,
But that's exactly the story we're looking at today, based on this source we've received.
right.
I gotta say though, up front, this source is completely unverified, and some of the details, they're so specific, so disturbing. It's worth taking a look, I think.
Yeah, this source, it alleges that there's a secret lab in Russia and a virus, they say it was engineered, to target specific groups of people. And there's even a connection to a major international incident that you guys are going to want to hear about this.
Yeah. Our goal here isn't to jump to any conclusions. Just think of us as your guides walking you through this source's narrative, piece by piece. We'll analyze what's being presented, look for any evidence we can find to support it, and we'll point out any inconsistencies we see along the way.
Right. To understand this story, we need to go back to, I guess, late 2018, early 2019. Do you remember China and Russia? There was kind of tense standoff at that time,
Yeah.
especially over the synthetic drug trade.
Oh, yeah. This source claims that Russia was desperate to stop that flow of drugs from China. It was really devastating their population, the source says. And they say that diplomatic efforts to pressure China were failing. They even suggest that some retaliatory smuggling operations were attempted,
Oh, wow.
but nothing really worked.
So this is where Vector comes in, right? The Vector State Scientific Center for Virology and Biotechnology in Russia. This is where, this source claims, is where the virus was created.
Right.
And get this, they allege it was designed to target specific ethnic groups in China and Southeast Asia.
Now, the idea of targeting a virus to specific groups, it's not just some sci-fi thing. It actually has some basis in science, but actually doing it, it'd require incredible sophistication.
Right, it's not as easy as it sounds, I guess. Okay, so let's say, just for argument's sake, this virus actually exists. How did Russia plan to get it into China? This is where it gets crazy. The source outlines this whole plan involving the Iranian IRGC, a fake vaccine, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. They allege that Russia used its relationship with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to transfer the virus, along with what they presented as a vaccine, to Chinese intelligence.
Wow.
They claim the IRGC passed it off as coming from some secret lab in Iraq, which, I mean, given the history in that region, it's not completely outlandish.
I guess not. So then what? The Chinese intelligence just gave this virus to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
That's what the source is claiming. And from there, they say 2 teams of Russian operatives were sent to Wuhan.
What?
Their alleged mission was to infect personnel at the institute and their families, to make it look like the outbreak started there, like a classic false flag operation.
Wow, that's crazy. But this plan, as crazy as it is, it didn't go exactly to plan, right?
It seems not. The source says there was an accidental outbreak in Iran. They suggest that the IRGC, they had kept samples of the virus and the fake vaccine, and, well, they experienced a leak, which led to those early cases in Iran.
Right, those are the ones that raised all those eyebrows everybody was wondering.
Right, exactly.
Hold on, this source, they go on to connect this whole thing to the downing of Ukraine International Airlines flight PS752 in January 2020.
That's where the story takes a really dark turn. They claim that an Iranian scientist, he was afraid he'd be exposed, so he gave a sample of the virus and the fake vaccine to a Canadian colleague who was on that flight.
Oh my God.
And, well, the source says the IRGC found out about it, but too late. And rather than risk that information getting out, they chose to just destroy the plane.
Oh my gosh. If you're listening to this and thinking, wait, this sounds like it's straight out of a movie, trust me, I get it. But before we just dismiss the whole thing, we need to take a closer look at what's being claimed here.
Right. And that's what we'll do in the next part of this deep dive. We're going to start digging into the evidence, or a lack of evidence, really. We'll look at what was going on geopolitically, the science behind bioweapons, and we'll explore any other possible explanations for these events.
Right, stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of our deep dive into this story. It's a wild one.
So let's go back to that tense relationship between China and Russia for a second.
Right.
The source claims that this whole thing started because of the synthetic drug trade. There was a lot of friction there back in late 2018, early 2019.
Yeah.
Does that hold up, you think?
Well, you got to remember what else was happening at that time. We had that trade war going on between the U.S. and China. And Russia, I guess they saw an opportunity to, to boost their exports to China. But it seems like this influx of synthetic drugs, it became a real problem for Moscow.
Yeah, and you can actually find reports from back then of Russian officials who were really frustrated with what they saw as China's unwillingness or maybe inability to get a handle on the flow of these drugs. They
Right.
even tried to retaliate a little bit, but ultimately it didn't really work.
Right. So the motive the source presents, I mean, it's dramatic, but it's not totally implausible.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess not.
Okay. Let's move on to this alleged bioweapon itself. The source claims that this virus was engineered to target certain ethnic groups. I mean, that's terrifying to even think about. But is that even scientifically possible?
Well, the science behind that, it's really complex. It's not something out of a comic book, though. I mean, there is some basis for it in science. But to actually target specific ethnic groups like that, to achieve that level of precision would require a level of sophistication, a level of understanding of genetics that, well, we haven't seen anything publicly acknowledged that's even close to that.
So it sounds like this source might be playing on our fears about bioweapons a little bit.
Yeah, maybe a little.
Okay, so even if we entertain the idea that this virus is real, how did it get from Russia to China? The source claims it went through Iran, then to Chinese intelligence, and finally ended up at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That just seems like such a roundabout way to do things, don't you think?
It does sound pretty elaborate, yeah. But that's kind of how espionage works. It relies on those layers, those intermediaries, those cutouts to make it harder to trace where things came from.
That's true. And we know that Russia and the Iranian IRGC, they have close ties, so that part of the story at least makes sense.
Yeah, that part's not totally unbelievable.
But what about the next step? They're claiming that the virus was given to Chinese intelligence, but disguised as being from a secret lab in Iraq. Does that seem likely to you?
That part does make me wonder. China has a really sophisticated intelligence network themselves. It seems unlikely they would just accept a virus sample from the IRGC without doing their homework and verifying where it really came from.
Right. And then there's that claim about two Russian operative teams being sent to Wuhan to deliberately infect people at the Institute. Have we seen any evidence to support that?
Nothing publicly available, as far as I know. You'd think there'd be something, in travel records, intelligence reports, something. But, well, that kind of information, it's not exactly easy to get your hands on.
Right.
And the source, they don't give any specifics about these operatives or their methods. It's all pretty vague, wouldn't you say?
It is very vague. So we've got a lot of gaps in this narrative, especially when it comes to how the virus was actually transmitted. It's starting to sound a bit like a game of telephone, where the story changes a little with each retelling.
Yeah, it does. And all those gaps, they make you question how reliable the source's claims really are.
Right, right. Okay, what about that alleged accidental outbreak in Iran? That detail seems to line up with what we know about the early days of the pandemic, doesn't it?
Well, it's true that Iran did have a big outbreak early on, but to just attribute it to a lab leak as part of this whole Russian plot, that's a pretty big leap.
Okay, so it's important to remember there could be other, simpler explanations.
Exactly. Don't forget, Iran had really close ties with China at that time. There was a lot of travel between the two countries, so it's entirely possible that the virus could have arrived in Iran through totally normal means, infected travelers, things like that.
So even though the source's claim about the Iranian outbreak seems to fit their story, we can't just ignore other, more plausible scenarios.
Right. We have to be careful not to cherry pick information to support one specific story.
Exactly. Okay, what about the source's claims about Ukraine International Airlines flight PS752? That idea that it was intentionally shot down to silence a scientist carrying the virus sample, it's really unsettling.
It's a disturbing claim, for sure. But don't forget, that incident was investigated thoroughly, and the conclusion, based on the evidence, is that it was a tragic accident, probably human error during a time of really high tensions between Iran and the U.S.
So basically, this source is suggesting this massive cover-up, implicating both Iran and Russia. Do we have any reason to believe that the official investigations just missed something this big?
Well, I mean, it's not impossible, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? We need more than just this source's word to overturn the findings of multiple independent investigations.
Okay, so far we've been pretty skeptical about all this. But what about that claim that Putin went into isolation because he was afraid of retaliation from China? We know that Putin was pretty much out of the public eye in the early months of the pandemic. Could that be evidence to support what the source is saying?
Well, Well, yeah, it's true that Putin kept a pretty low profile during that time, but you got to look at the bigger picture, too. This was a time when the whole world was scared. There was so much uncertainty. A lot of world leaders were limiting their public appearances. It was just a natural response to a completely unprecedented situation.
So saying that Putin only did that because of this plot, that might be reading too much into it.
Yeah, I think so. We can't just jump to conclusions based on one piece of information.
Right. Okay, what about the Sputnik V vaccine? The source claims it was developed a lot earlier than they admitted, specifically because of this whole plot. And they also say that the Russian leadership got the vaccine way before the public did. Is there any truth to that?
Well, the development timeline of Sputnik V, it's definitely kind of murky. Russia did announce their vaccine early on, but it's not clear exactly how long they've been working on it before that. As for the Russian leadership getting vaccinated early, I mean, that wouldn't be that unusual, would it? A lot of countries prioritize their leaders for vaccination.
So once again, it seems like the source is taking facts and twisting them to fit their story.
Yeah, they're taking little bits of truth and stretching them.
Right. Okay, last thing. That explosion and fire at the Vector Lab in September 2019, the source claims that it was staged to get rid of evidence.
Right.
Do the official reports back that up at all?
Officially, they're saying it was a gas cylinder blast and the fire was an accident. But there were some concerns at the time about the safety protocols at the lab. Whether those concerns were justified or not, that's another question entirely.
So it's tempting to connect the dots and say this was all part of a cover-up. But we can't just assume there was malicious intent without solid evidence.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the main problem with this whole thing. This source, we can't verify their claims. And it's a big story, potentially global implications, and we're relying on just one source.
So where does that leave us? We looked at the geopolitics, the science of bioweapons, the alleged transfer of the virus, the Iranian outbreak, the plane crash, Putin's behavior, Sputnik V, and the Vector Lab incident. And some elements of the story seem plausible at first glance. But when you really look into it, there are so many gaps, inconsistencies, and there's just no evidence to back it up.
That's a great summary. This source's story, it's definitely compelling, but it's just full of holes. It's like a textbook conspiracy theory. Bits of truth mixed with speculation, conjecture, and, well, fabrication.
But even if we say the whole plot is bogus, there's still some interesting things here that we should think about more. Like what the source said about the synthetic drug trade and the tension between China and Russia, it raises some valid questions about what was going on in the world leading up to the pandemic.
I agree. And that early outbreak in Iran, even if it wasn't part of this plot, it shows how important transparency and international cooperation are when it comes to pandemics. That's a lesson we should all remember.
So we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive going through all these claims, looking at the evidence, or lack of evidence, really.
Yeah.
And there are some pretty big gaps and inconsistencies in this whole story. But what I want to talk about now is the why. Why would someone make up a story like this? What's their motivation?
That's the big question, isn't it? When we talk about disinformation, figuring out the motive, that's a big part of understanding what they're really trying to do.
So what are some possible reasons someone would just fabricate a story like this?
Well, one possibility is straight up propaganda. They could be trying to, stir things up between China and Russia,
Right.
maybe to benefit someone else, a third party.
Like a divide and conquer kind of thing.
Exactly. By making Russia look like the bad guy, like they're willing to use bioweapons. They could be trying to isolate Russia, damage its relationships with other countries,
Yeah,
and ultimately weaken it.
that makes sense. What else could be going on here?
Another possibility is, domestic political manipulation. They could be trying to make the Russian government look bad, maybe to fuel opposition and dissent within Russia.
So by making Putin look reckless, paranoid, even responsible for the pandemic, they could be trying to weaken his power in Russia.
Exactly. It's a pretty classic tactic if you're trying to undermine a leader. Make people lose trust, make them question whether the leader's competent.
And the source keeps bringing up Putin's fear of China retaliating.
Yeah.
Could that be a way to tap into, those anxieties that already exist in Russia about China getting more powerful?
Absolutely. Exploiting those pre-existing fears and prejudices, that's a common tactic in disinformation. It makes the story feel more believable, more real, more emotional, and therefore more effective.
So it's not just about spreading lies. It's about messing with people's emotions and how they see things.
Exactly. Disinformation, it works on a psychological level. It wants to make people feel afraid, angry, resentful, and then use those emotions to change their beliefs and actions.
So we've got propaganda, domestic political manipulation. Are there any other theories we should be thinking about?
Oh, sure. Don't forget about good old-fashioned financial gain. Maybe they're trying to make money off this story, sell it to a media outlet, or use it to boost their own platform, get more attention.
So basically clickbait, sensationalism sells, even if it's all made up.
Sadly, yeah. In the digital age, with everyone's attention span so short, even the craziest stories can get a lot of traffic and make money.
So this source, they could have a few different things motivating them. Ideology, political ambitions, and just plain greed.
It's rarely just one thing. Disinformation campaigns are usually pretty complex. There are a lot of different motives all tangled up together.
Okay, even if we say this whole story is fake, it does make you think about disinformation in general. There's so much information out there these days. How do we know what to believe?
Right. How do we know what's real and what's not? It's tough. It really comes down to critical thinking. We have to approach information with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So what are some things we should watch out for? What can we do to protect ourselves from falling for this kind of stuff?
Well, the first thing is always look at the source. Who's giving you this information? Do they have a bias, an agenda? Are they known for being accurate, trustworthy?
So just because it's online doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly. Check the source. Look for verification from multiple sources, especially sources known for fact-checking and good journalism.
What else?
Pay attention to the language they use. Is it super sensationalized? Is it trying to make you feel a certain way? Does it rely on stereotypes or fear-mongering? Those are all red flags.
So if it sounds too good to be true or too crazy to believe, it probably is.
Exactly. Trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to question what you're reading or hearing. A little skepticism goes a long way.
Any other strategies we can use?
Yeah, one of the most important things is to cross-check information. Fact-checking websites, reputable news organizations, academic institutions, they can help you understand the context and see the bigger picture.
And what about sharing stuff online? It's so easy to just click share without thinking about it.
Resist that urge. Before you share anything, check if it's accurate. Even if you don't mean to, sharing disinformation can help it spread and do more harm.
So it's not just about what we read, it's about what we share too.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to be careful about the information we put out there.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We looked at this whole story, examined the claims, and thought about the motivations behind it. And even though we debunked this particular story, it shows how important critical thinking and media literacy are, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. Disinformation is everywhere. We all have to be vigilant, and we have to put in the effort to stay informed and make good decisions.
So next time you see a crazy story, remember what we talked about today. Question the source, think about their motives, look for evidence, and think before you share. If we all use our critical thinking skills, we can help fight disinformation and make our society more informed and resilient.
Well said. Remember, the truth is out there, but it takes effort to find it.
That's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride through espionage, bioweapons, and disinformation. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay skeptical.